August 4th, 1951. The sun had barely risen over the brittle horizon of Sparrow Ridge when Harold Greene locked the front door of his adobe house for the last time. The wooden latch clicked shut with an eerie finality, as if the house itself understood what was coming. A few neighbors, sipping morning coffee from their porches, watched as he walked past the dusty fence line, wearing a wide-brimmed hat, khaki trousers, and a canvas satchel slung over one shoulder. No one waved. No one called out. Something about the way he moved, deliberate, mechanical, almost rehearsed, made them all feel uneasy. By noon, he was gone. He never came back. Harold's disappearance became local legend, but before that, it was just another desert story, one of many whispered between gas station attendants and barbershop regulars. Most assumed he'd lost his mind, wandered too far, collapsed beneath the unrelenting Arizona sun. The sheriff said as much, half-heartedly, but not everyone believed it. Some swore they saw strange symbols in the sand near his house that day. Others claimed to have heard voices echoing from the canyons for nights afterward, one of them unmistakably Harold's. And then there was the blood. Just a few drops, dark and dried, near the back porch. The sheriff dismissed it as nothing, a nosebleed maybe. Coyotes. Something simple. But the pattern, it was no ordinary spatter. It circled a rock in the shape of an eye. If stories like this captivate you, if you're drawn to the unexplained, the forgotten, and the truly unsettling, don't forget to subscribe. There's so much more buried in the past waiting to be uncovered. Harold Greene wasn't always a ghost story. Just a decade earlier, he was a respected professor of folklore at a university back east. Brilliant, sharp, intense. After the war, he came to Arizona for peace, or at least that's what the official story said. He bought a modest plot on the edge of the Sonoran Desert and built a house himself. Thick walls, tiny windows, no phone. Locals said it looked more like a bunker than a home. He kept to himself mostly. He'd make the occasional trip into town, always the same general store, same time of day, always alone. The shop owner, old Carl Jennings, recalled Harold muttering about desert echoes and unseen mouths. At first, folks chalked it up to eccentricity. War does things to a man, they said. He's probably just trying to find peace. But by 1950, the whispers started. People claimed to see lights flickering from Harold's house in the dead of night, strange shadows cast across the ridgeline. One rancher swore he heard chanting, soft and low, like wind dragging through bone. Another woman, Mrs. Langley, said she saw Harold staring directly into the sun for nearly an hour one afternoon, unmoving, lips parted, and then, in early August, something shifted. Two locals, Jake Holloway and his son, spotted Harold standing at the edge of the desert at dusk. He was barefoot, his arms stretched outward, whispering words they couldn't understand. When they approached, he turned, smiled faintly, and said only, "It's almost time." That was August 3rd. The next morning he left. Within hours, the sheriff was at his door. The neighbors had grown nervous. The house was locked, windows bolted from inside. Sheriff Tom Riley pried open the back door, stepping into a silence so heavy it seemed to bend the air. The interior was sparse. No sign of struggle, no mess, nothing missing. But on the desk in the study lay an envelope addressed simply, "To whom it may concern." Inside was a single sheet of yellowing paper. "I've seen what lies beneath the sand," it read. "They think I've forgotten, but I remember too much." There were no further clues, no footprints beyond the initial trail leading into the desert, no supplies missing except for a canteen, a journal, and a compass. His vehicle sat untouched in the garage. The sheriff organized a small search party the next day. They followed the tracks until the wind erased them, not even 10 miles in. No bones, no clothing, nothing. Except the silence. Not the normal stillness of desert plains, but something heavier, an absence of noise so complete it made grown men shiver. One of the deputies, a seasoned tracker, swore he heard breathing behind him the whole time. He never joined another search. In the days that followed, locals avoided Harold's property. The mailbox began collecting dust. Weeds crept over the gravel walkway. Coyotes howled at night, longer and louder than before. Weeks passed, then months, and Harold Greene, once a man of letters and logic, faded into a myth. His name became a warning, his house a relic. Children dared each other to step on his porch. None stayed long. But the question lingered, gnawed at those who remembered. Why did Harold walk into the desert? And what did he mean when he wrote, "I remember too much"? Whatever answers lay beneath that scorching expanse, they didn't want to be found, not yet. Before he became the town's ghost story, Harold Greene was a man of stature, intelligence, and peculiar intensity. Born in Boston in 1904 to a family of historians and linguists, Harold grew up immersed in the world of ancient texts and forgotten civilizations. His father, a professor of comparative mythology, often took Harold to lectures and field expeditions. By the age of 12, he was translating Latin and deciphering crude pictographs from archaeological digs his father brought home. He graduated summa cum laude from Harvard in 1925, majoring in folklore and linguistic anthropology. By 30, he had published 2 academic books on indigenous spiritual systems, the second of which, Echoes Beyond the Firelight, earned him national acclaim for its synthesis of Native American oral traditions with Jungian psychoanalysis. That success led to a professorship at a prestigious East Coast university, where he taught for over a decade. But those who knew Harold well said that something in him shifted during World War II. He was recruited by the Office of Strategic Services in 1942, leveraging his fluency in multiple languages and deep knowledge of indigenous cultures. Though the exact nature of his assignments remains classified, fragments from declassified reports suggest he was involved in psychological operations and coded communication rooted in cultural symbolism. He spent much of the war in the American Southwest, studying tribal lands and recording obscure ceremonial chants, some so old they had no known English equivalent. When the war ended, Harold didn't return to the university. Instead, he disappeared from the public eye for nearly a year. When he resurfaced in 1947, he was a different man, gaunt, silent, eyes shadowed with something that didn't resemble fatigue, but something closer to dread. He claimed to be finished with academia, sold most of his belongings, withdrew from public life, and relocated to Arizona. No explanation, no farewell. He purchased a plot of arid land outside a town no one east of New Mexico had heard of. Locals were puzzled. Why would a man of his status, an author, a scholar, choose Sparrow Ridge, a patch of desert known only for its ghost towns and snakebite fatalities? But he was cordial if distant, built his house with his own hands, brick by brick, paid in cash. Drove a battered navy blue truck, never newer than the 30s. Frequented the post office and the general store, spoke politely and kept to himself. To most, he was just a quiet outsider, with strange eyes and even stranger books. Then came the tragedy that truly sealed his isolation. His wife, Eleanor. They'd married in 1939, a few years before the war. She was a musician, classically trained, known for her haunting renditions of folk lullabies from around the world. The few townsfolk who met her described her as gentle, elegant, with a laugh that caught the wind. She moved to Arizona with Harold, though no one knew if she ever truly settled. She was rarely seen outside the house. In April of 1947, Eleanor died. Official cause, accident. A fall from the observation platform Harold had built atop the house. The coroner wrote it off as tragic misstep, possibly exacerbated by heat exhaustion. But rumor spread fast in small towns. Some claimed they'd heard shouting that day. Others said Harold ran through town at dusk barefoot and wild-eyed, clutching a page torn from one of his books. A local boy swore he saw Harold digging a hole at midnight, humming one of Eleanor's songs. After her death, Harold became more than reclusive. He became haunted, no longer just a man who kept to himself, but someone visibly retreating from the world. His once sharp grooming gave way to overgrown stubble and sunburned skin. When he did appear in town, he often stared too long at the horizon, as though trying to see beyond it. Old Carl at the general store remembered one conversation that stuck with him. Harold had been standing at the register, holding a tin of coffee, when he said, She didn't fall, she was taken. It was the song. The song opened the gate. He paid and left before Carl could ask what he meant. By 1949, most residents had stopped talking to him altogether. They didn't dislike him, but he made them uncomfortable. Something about his silences, the way he watched birds as if waiting for them to speak, the way he sometimes whispered to the desert itself. Still, no one expected what came next. That August morning, when Harold vanished into the sand, most simply assumed it was the final act of a man unraveling. But those who remembered Eleanor's death, his cryptic words, and the way his house seemed to hum with some hidden current, they weren't so sure. They said Harold wasn't running away from something, he was going toward it. Harold Greene's house stood like a monument to forgotten things. Perched alone on a scrub-covered ridge, it overlooked a sweep of parched earth and scorched sky. Locals called it the fort, half in jest, half in discomfort. Built from thick adobe brick, the structure bore no flourishes, no softness. Just hard angles, narrow windows, and a tower that loomed over the desert like a lighthouse with no ocean. But it wasn't the tower that disturbed people. It was what lay beneath. When Sheriff Tom Riley entered the house after Harold's disappearance, he expected clutter, dust, maybe signs of distress. Instead, he found something unsettlingly sterile, everything in its place. Dishes washed, bed made. Shelves lined with books in Latin, Apache, and Nahuatl. Walls devoid of photographs, but etched in long, winding patterns of paint, symbols neither decorative nor familiar. They spiraled, layered over time in a language no one could read. The air inside was thick, dry, laced with something metallic and herbal, a smell like rust and sage. And silence, not just the absence of sound, but a density that pressed against the skin. The living room contained a single chair facing west, pointed directly at the window that framed the desert. On the floor beside it, a cracked leather notebook. It contained no entries, only a list of numbers, dates perhaps. Some crossed out, some circled. The last one read, August 4th, 1951. Riley moved cautiously through the house. The kitchen was untouched, pantry fully stocked, cabinets labeled in neat handwriting. On the counter, a tin plate held what looked like dried herbs arranged in a deliberate spiral. Beneath it, burned into the wood, was a small handprint, too small for Harold's. The bedroom was darker than expected. The windows, though present, were covered with cloth bound tightly from the outside. The bed was narrow, the sheets stiff. On the nightstand, a photograph of Eleanor tucked behind a cracked pane of glass. She stood in front of the observation tower, hair pinned back, a strained smile on her lips. What caught Riley's attention most was the basement door. It was reinforced, metal brackets, heavy locks, not something a man living alone would need. The handle was cold to the touch, even in the desert heat. It opened with effort, revealing stairs descending into blackness. Riley hesitated, then drew his flashlight and stepped down. The basement was larger than expected, more a bunker than a cellar. Brick-lined walls covered with more symbols, now carved directly into the surface. Dozens of them. On the far end, a desk bolted into the floor, and behind it, a map. It wasn't a normal map. It showed the Sonoran Desert, but altered. Rivers drawn where none existed, mountain ranges mislabeled, an area near Sparrow Ridge marked with a red X and labeled in Harold's handwriting, Place of Red Silence. Around the border of the map, one phrase repeated again and again in looping manic script. It watches. It remembers. It watches. It remembers. Riley flipped through the desk drawers. Most were filled with carefully catalogued documents, field notes, photocopies of ancient texts, sketches of skeletal figures with elongated limbs. One folder labeled E contained pages of musical notation interspersed with ritual chants. Most were incomplete, but one, titled Threshold Sequence, was marked Do Not Play, even in silence. It was then he noticed the second door. Tucked behind a curtain of black cloth hidden from view was another entrance, smaller, arched, made of weathered wood bound with iron studs. There was no handle, no lock, just a symbol at its center. an open eye flanked by two downward-pointing arrows. He tried to push it. Nothing. It didn't budge. On the floor nearby, another note, handwritten and unsigned. The threshold must not be crossed alone. It opens both ways. Riley stood there for a long while, flashlight flickering as his breath echoed off the stone. He felt it then, a subtle pressure like a presence behind the walls, watching without eyes. The air grew colder. The silence deepened. He left the basement without opening that door. Back upstairs, something had shifted. The symbols on the walls now seemed to hum, not in sound but in sensation, like vibration beneath the skin. Riley took one last look around before locking the door behind him. He never spoke publicly about what he saw in that house, but his demeanor changed. He became withdrawn, less certain, told his deputy once in passing, "That house isn't abandoned. It's waiting." Over the years, trespassers dared to enter. Most left immediately, claiming headaches, nausea, dreams that didn't belong to them. A few carved their names into the outer wall. None returned a second time. Locals say if you stand by the back porch at dusk, you can still smell the sage and rust. Some swear they've heard music, soft and broken, echoing up from the ground. One man claimed he saw a figure in the tower watching him through cracked glass. But there's no one up there, not anymore. Sheriff Tom Riley spent the next week piecing together what little he could. The desert had already swallowed Harold Greene's trail, but Riley wasn't ready to let the mystery go. Something about the house, about the way Harold had prepared, refused to let him rest. This wasn't the story of a man who lost his mind and wandered into the sun. It was the story of someone who believed deeply that he was going somewhere specific. He started with the neighbors. Most were hesitant, unsure what to say, but eventually fragments began to surface. Anna Langley, who lived half a mile north, recalled seeing Harold walking in circles in his backyard 2 days before he vanished, dragging a long stick through the dirt. "He was drawing something," she said, "but it wasn't random, it was like a symbol." Then he erased it with his foot, stood there and just stared at the sky. Old Carl at the store remembered the last time Harold came in. He asked for salt, just salt, bought 10 pounds of it, said he needed to make a boundary. Carl chuckled then nervously, said it was the only thing that worked against the wind. Riley returned to the house, more determined. In Harold's study, he had previously overlooked a drawer stuck shut beneath the desk. After prying it open, he found a bundle of loose papers and one rolled-up scroll wrapped in cloth. Inside was a crude hand-drawn map of the surrounding desert. Unlike standard maps, this one was marked with symbols, concentric circles, jagged arrows, and one area shaded in thick red ink, labeled in Harold's distinctive handwriting, "The Place of Red Silence." Riley cross-referenced the map with known landmarks. The location didn't correspond to anything official. No trails, no geological features. Just empty space about 20 miles east, deeper into the desert than most dared to go. What caught Riley's attention most, though, was that Harold had drawn not one, but 3 routes to reach it, each one winding, avoiding specific coordinates, as though there were things he was intentionally not walking over. Back at the sheriff's office, Riley consulted town records and military maps. The area marked Red Silence had no recorded use, not military, not private, no homesteads, mines, or wells. But curiously, in a faded 1914 prospecting report, the site was described as terrain unsound for mining, area unusually quiet, wind patterns disrupted. The prospector's note ended abruptly. "One of our mules refused to proceed. We heard singing." Riley shared none of this with the townspeople. Instead, he quietly sought out Mateo Ortiz, a tracker from the Tohono O'odham Nation with a reputation for navigating the harsher parts of the desert. Mateo listened without interruption as Riley laid out Harold's route, the symbols and the name Red Silence. When Riley paused, Mateo spoke carefully. "That name. It's not English." "Not really, it's translation. There's an older word, chokwi, means land that refuses voice. My grandfather wouldn't go near it." "Why not?" Riley asked. "Because it remembers." They arranged to travel the route together, but not yet. Matteo insisted on time, to prepare, to speak with elders, to gather protection. In the meantime, Riley returned once more to Harold's house, this time examining the backyard where Anna had seen him drawing. Though the wind had cleared much near the edge of the fence, Riley found remnants, a faint etching in the ground, now sun-baked into the dirt. A spiral intersected by 3 lines. Riley photographed it, then flipped through Harold's papers. In one margin of a journal, he found a matching drawing. Next to it, Harold had scribbled, "Path of wounding, must not be walked twice." The journal itself was more revealing than Riley had expected. Though much of it bordered on the incoherent, there were recurring themes. Whispers in the wind, shapes in the sand, a presence beneath the rock. He wrote of a figure made of bones and silence. A shadow that could not be followed because it moved ahead of you, always watching. "They are not spirits," Harold had written. "They are not dead. They are the echoes left behind when a name is erased." Riley wasn't sure what that meant, but what chilled him most was a final note tucked in the back cover. "It's not madness if it's real. And it's not death if you don't forget." As he closed the journal, a gust of dry wind rattled the windows. For a moment, Riley thought he heard something faint, too faint to be sure. A word carried on the air. His name. He stood still, listening. Nothing. But the silence felt heavier now, weighted, like something had taken notice. In the following days, Sheriff Tom Riley immersed himself in Harold Greene's journals. There were 12 in total, bound in cracked leather, their pages filled with erratic handwriting, faded ink, and occasional diagrams drawn with obsessive precision. At first, the entries were academic, observations on folklore, local legends, and linguistic patterns in native dialects. But as the pages turned, the tone shifted. Curiosity gave way to obsession. One of the earliest entries read, "The desert does not hide its secrets. It waits for someone who will listen. The others called me mad, but I heard it. I felt it. The air shifted when I stood on the threshold. Something old sleeps beneath the stone." Riley flipped through page after page of increasingly frenzied observations. Harold began referencing entities with names like the Watcher Between Winds, the One Beneath Memory, and most frequently, the Bone Walker. Sometimes he described them as metaphor, symbols of loss, grief, and forgotten knowledge. But other times, especially in the later entries, he treated them as literal beings, present, active. "It moves in daylight. Most think the night is where fear lives. They're wrong. It comes when you think you're safe. When the sun burns and your shadow stretches the longest, that's when it walks." The sketches grew more elaborate. One in particular made Riley pause. A tall, skeletal figure with impossibly long arms and hollow sockets, standing beside a crude map of the same region, marked in Harold's other chart, the place of red silence. The creature's mouth was stitched shut. Below it, in thick charcoal, Harold had written, "It takes your name first, then your voice, then your shape." It wasn't just fear that poured from the pages, it was reverence. As though Harold believed he was documenting something sacred, something that predated language itself, and buried among the hysteria were moments of clarity, jarring in their contrast. Eleanor heard it first. She thought it was the wind, but it whispered in rhythm like breath. She called it music, but I think it was remembering. I should have warned her, but I was too fascinated. I opened the door. This was the first time Riley found a direct reference to Eleanor's death that deviated from the official report. As he dug deeper, he discovered a second journal, entirely devoted to dreams. Nightmares Harold had catalogued like field data. Recurring themes included endless staircases, teeth buried in sand, a mirror that didn't reflect light. The dreams began when I stayed overnight in the canyon. I brought no instruments, just my ears. At midnight, the wind stopped, not slowed, stopped. The silence was complete, and in that stillness, something began to move. I couldn't see it, but I felt it brush my skin. It whispered a name. I don't remember what it was, but I knew it was mine. One of the final volumes contained fewer words and more sketches, symbols carved into rock faces, abstract spirals, a structure that resembled a stone arch buried in sand. Next to it, a scrawled phrase, "The gate breathes, I've heard it exhale." Riley felt the weight of the words, not because he believed them, but because Harold so clearly had. The certainty leapt from the ink, unwavering and absolute. This wasn't a descent into madness. It was a descent into belief, a conviction that something ancient, intelligent, and buried beneath Arizona's deserts had reached out to Harold, and he had answered. And then came the final entry, short, clean, no scratches or overwritten lines, no panic. August 3rd. The voices returned. "They don't call me by name anymore. They call me by memory. I know what waits. I am not afraid. I go tomorrow. I must answer." The precision of that last line unnerved Riley more than any sketch or chant. Harold wasn't afraid. He was ready. The next morning, Riley took the journals to Mateo Ortiz. The tracker sat with them in silence, flipping slowly, occasionally stopping to murmur under his breath in O'odham. When he finished, he said, "Some of these words, they're older than the language I speak. They come from stories my grandfather would only whisper during storms, things that live in silence, things that remember when the earth was still wet." He tapped the sketch of the bone walker. "This one is known. In parts of the desert they call it Tiakum, the hollow that walks. It doesn't kill, it takes. You disappear, but not your memory, not your shape. Some say it's why shadows stretch longer in the heat." Riley asked if it was myth or metaphor. Mateo didn't answer. Instead, he pointed to one page near the center of the journal. Harold had drawn concentric circles with a mark at the center, the same spiral Riley had found in the backyard. Mateo traced the lines, then whispered, "That's not a symbol." He looked up, his face pale beneath the desert tan. "It's a warning." Mateo Ortiz didn't speak lightly when he called it a warning. In the traditions of his people, silence carried weight. It wasn't emptiness, it was presence. And the desert, he said, had a memory. It remembered every footstep, every trespass, every name. In the days that followed, Sheriff Riley met with elders from the Tohono O'odham and Apache tribes, seeking any mention of the symbols and figures Harold had recorded. Many were hesitant. Some refused to speak entirely, but one, an elder named Nana Akil from the San Xavier district, finally agreed to talk, on the condition that Riley would never repeat her words to those who would mock or commodify them. She sat beneath a mesquite tree, her voice low and deliberate. "There is something in the South Desert," she began. "It has no name, not one we speak aloud. But long ago they called it the Hollow Walker, the one who echoes. It is not alive like you and me. It does not breathe. It does not hunt. It waits. It waits for those who remember too much." She described stories passed down for generations, stories not written but carried through whispers, tales of travelers who vanished without a trace, not just lost to the heat or the terrain, but erased. Their faces forgotten by loved ones, their names removed from records. Only fragments remained, a shoe in the dust, a shadow where light bent wrong, a name someone couldn't quite recall. "It lives where the desert goes quiet," she said, "where not even the insects move. That's how you know. The air presses down, your ears ring, and then it finds you." Riley asked what it wanted. She paused, then answered, "It doesn't want, it remembers. It pulls memory from the land, from the bones beneath it. If you carry too much of the old stories, it will come for you." When he showed her Harold's sketches of the Bone Walker, she looked away, refusing to meet his eyes. "He went where none return," she said, "and he took the old names with him." Riley returned to Mateo with the story. The tracker said he'd heard similar things growing up, legends his grandfather warned him never to repeat near canyon edges or at nightfall. He told Riley of a small mining expedition in 1891 financed by Eastern investors. The group had ignored tribal warnings and set up camp near a place they called Dead Echo Hollow. None returned. Later, one of the miners' journals was recovered in a prospector's shack 2 towns over. It contained a final, frantic entry. "It walks in daylight. We saw it, all of us. No shadow, no face, just bone and wind and silence. Tom spoke to it. His words were not his, and now he's empty. Mateo said the mining site was abandoned and erased from most maps. The area hadn't been entered since. A few had tried, curiosity seekers, researchers, but something always stopped them. Broken equipment, fainting spells, inexplicable vehicle failures. But Harold had found it. He'd known where to go, and more importantly, how. The clues were in his journals, the layered routes, the warnings about direction, the salt lines. Matteo explained that in some traditions, salt wasn't for protection from spirits, but for anchoring the self, as if Harold knew whatever waited out there could unmake a man, not kill, but untether, disassemble, remove. Riley began to suspect that Harold's quest wasn't academic at all. It was personal, a pilgrimage, perhaps not to find knowledge, but to bury it, or be buried with it. Among Harold's notes, one passage returned again and again, always underlined, "Do not seek silence. Let it find you, but never answer it." And yet, Harold had answered, willingly, even joyfully. Why? Riley began to believe that Harold didn't just fear the Bone Walker, he revered it. He may have believed that in surrendering himself he was becoming part of something greater, a memory preserved. A fragment recorded in a system older than language, but such reverence comes at a price. And it wasn't just Harold who had paid. Riley requested access to older town archives, searching for patterns. What he found chilled him. A cattle herder vanished in 1873, last seen walking east, talking to the wind. A prospector in 1912, known for collecting native artifacts, found dead without injury, eyes open, body mummified in a posture of prayer. In 1937, a missionary who had been preaching near the tribal lands disappeared with 2 others during a storm. Their journals, later found intact, contained entries describing a place of perfect quiet. Every 30 to 40 years, someone vanished under the same signs, and every time, silence followed. No press, no formal investigations, just whispers. Now it was 1951, and Harold Greene had vanished on schedule. By late August, Sheriff Tom Riley could no longer ignore the pull of the map. The circle-marked place of red silence gnawed at his sleep, hovering in the edges of his vision, even when he tried to look away. Logic told him Harold Greene was gone, lost to heat or madness, but something deeper urged him forward. A need to know, a need to see. He didn't go alone. Matteo Ortiz agreed to guide the way. He brought along another man, Elias Finch, a former student of Harold's from back east, who had recently arrived in town, driven by rumors and old ties. Elias, thin and pale from city life, looked misplaced beneath the Arizona sun, but his eyes were sharp and his questions sharper. He carried copies of Harold's writings clutched like relics. The trio set out at dawn. They followed Harold's map to the letter. No shortcuts, no improvisation. Every twist and curve of the path matched the sketches. Matteo insisted they move slow, respectful. "You don't walk the desert," he said. "You ask it." By noon, the heat was merciless. The kind of heat that made sweat evaporate before it touched skin, that filled the lungs with dust. Buzzards circled high above. The world was nothing but ochre, rock and shadow, but the trail remained. They found signs. First, a boot print, too deep to be from the wind, too recent to dismiss. Then, a scrap of canvas, sun-bleached but unmistakably torn from a satchel. Both belonged to Harold. Riley picked up the canvas and turned it in his hand, half expecting it to hum. By the 3rd day, they were far from any known trail. The land grew stranger, not just in shape but in sensation. The wind changed direction with no warning. Animal tracks appeared, then vanished mid-path. At night, the stars looked wrong, familiar constellations fractured by unfamiliar placements. Matteo said nothing, but his silence grew heavier. Then came the voices. On the morning of the 4th day, Elias woke them early, pale and shaken. "I heard him," he whispered. "Harold, last night. He was outside the tent. He said my name." Riley checked for tracks. There were none. But the sand just beyond the campfire bore a shallow indentation, round, kneeling, as if someone had rested there, motionless, watching. Mateo pulled out a pouch of salt and poured a line around their tent that night. The fifth day brought them to a shallow ravine, dry and choked with brittle brush. At the bottom, half buried, lay something that stopped them cold. A compass. Riley knelt and picked it up. It was warped, the glass cracked, needle bent and spinning slowly despite the still air. He recognized it immediately. It had sat on Harold's desk for years. "It's not rusted," Elias whispered. "It's melted." They climbed out of the ravine in silence. By evening, the terrain began to shift. The rocks turned redder, the sand finer. The air changed, less movement, less sound. Even the wind seemed reluctant to enter. Birds stopped appearing. The sun, still high, felt dimmer somehow, as if veiled. And then, for the first time in days, the desert fell completely silent. No buzz of insects. No crunch of wind, just stillness. Riley felt it immediately, the pressure in his ears like descending into deep water. Mateo whispered, "We've crossed the boundary." Ahead, the ground rose slightly, forming a wide, open plateau. The map marked it plainly. Red silence. They stepped onto the stone with reverence. The change was immediate. The moment Riley's boot touched the plateau, sound dropped away entirely, not muffled, gone. He opened his mouth, spoke Elias's name, but heard nothing, not even his own breath. Elias stumbled, clutching his ears. Mateo grabbed his arm, guiding him back to the edge. There the silence lifted, just enough to hear again. Elias's voice cracked. "I saw him." Riley turned. "Who?" "Harold." He was standing there at the center, but he looked wrong, like he was wearing himself. No one responded. That night they camped on the edge of the plateau. The wind returned faintly. The fire refused to stay lit, flickering out every few minutes. Elias didn't sleep. Neither did Riley. In the early hours, Mateo vanished. No sound, no struggle. Just gone. His boots remained. The morning Mateo disappeared, the desert was colder than it had any right to be. The sun rose as always, but its warmth never reached the skin. Riley stood at the edge of the plateau, scanning the lifeless expanse. Mateo's boots sat side by side where he'd left them, neatly placed, undisturbed. No drag marks, no footprints leading away, just absence. Elias was crouched beside them, muttering to himself. His hands trembled as he turned Harold's journal pages, trying to find something, anything, that made sense of what had happened. Riley knew the look in his eyes. It was the kind you saw in war, just before a man broke. "He didn't leave," Elias whispered. "He was taken." Riley didn't answer. He didn't have to. Everything about this place confirmed what neither of them wanted to say aloud. By noon the wind died again. The air turned thick, almost syrupy. Riley attempted to walk the perimeter of the plateau, marking their path with chalk on stone. But each mark faded within minutes. The chalk dissolved, not blown away but absorbed, as if the rock itself refused to hold memory. Elias began to pace, watching the center of the plateau where he claimed to have seen Harold. He refused to step onto the stone again, insisting the shape he'd seen wasn't quite right. "It wasn't him," Elias said. "It looked like him, moved like him, but its face, it didn't have a mouth, just a space, and the eyes, they weren't looking out." They were looking in. That night they camped farther from the plateau's edge. The silence pressed in more than ever. Elias refused to sleep. Riley sat with him, listening to the desert breathe, slow, unnatural, like an animal sleeping just beneath the surface. Just past midnight the whispering began. It wasn't a sound, not exactly, more like a memory forced into the mind. A whisper without vibration, a presence without shape. Riley heard his wife's voice, not words, just the sound she used to make when humming to herself while folding laundry, a low, warm tune that only she knew. But she had died 4 years ago. He stood, heart pounding, searching the darkness. Elias was sitting cross-legged now, eyes wide, lips moving soundlessly. His journal lay open beside him, pages fluttering in a wind Riley could not feel. Then the humming stopped, replaced by silence even deeper than before. Riley took a step forward and saw something move at the edge of the plateau. It wasn't Harold. It wasn't anyone. It stood taller than a man, yet cast no shadow in the moonlight. Its body was too long, too thin, arms hanging well past the knees. Its skin, or what passed for it, looked like stone wrapped in old cloth. It didn't walk, it glided, and then it turned its head. Where a face should have been, there was only smoothness, no mouth, no nose, just two deep sockets that pulsed faintly with light, as if remembering something old. Riley couldn't look away. The creature didn't speak, but its presence pushed into his thoughts. A sensation more than a message, and in that pressure, Riley felt a word form, not spoken, not even written, just understood. Remember. The thing lifted its arm, pointing directly at him. Then it vanished. No sound, no wind, just gone. Riley staggered back, breath ragged. Elias was now weeping quietly, hands over his ears, eyes shut tight. "I saw them all," Elias whispered. "Faces. Hundreds of them, in the stone, watching, and I knew them. Names I didn't remember knowing. They were waiting for me." The rest of the night passed in wordless terror. Neither man slept. The fire wouldn't stay lit. Every noise was swallowed. The stars above seemed farther away than ever before. By dawn they had made a decision. They would leave. Now. Whatever answers lay in the place of red silence, they no longer wanted them. Mateo was gone. Harold was gone. And something else was watching. But as they packed, Elias froze. "What is that?" he asked, pointing. Riley turned and saw it. Just beyond the ridge, standing utterly still, was a figure, not tall, human-sized, worn hat, satchel over the shoulder, Harold Greene. He stood facing them, no movement, no signal, just presence. His face obscured by shadow, but posture unmistakable. Riley took one step forward, and Harold vanished, instantly, as if he had never been. Elias collapsed to his knees. "It's not him," he said, shaking. "It's using him like a mask." Riley helped him up. They didn't speak again. They turned away from the plateau and began the long walk back, but the silence followed. They left before the sun fully rose, each step away from the plateau feeling like peeling off a second skin. The silence, thick and clinging, retreated only gradually. Riley didn't speak, and Elias barely looked up. They walked for hours, eyes fixed forward, afraid to glance back, unsure of what they might see if they did. By the time they reached the edge of the marked map, the air returned to normal. The wind moved. Birds called faintly in the distance, but nothing felt right. It was as if they had brought something back with them, something that watched without watching, that listened without ears. That night, Elias insisted they camp beneath a rock overhang, avoiding open sky. He sat with his journal in his lap, hands clenched, refusing to close his eyes. "It's still there," he muttered. "In my head. Like I left a door open and it slipped inside." Riley didn't argue. He understood. He'd begun to feel it too, whispers not in his ears, but behind them. Like a memory out of place, waiting to speak. At some point during the night, Riley fell asleep. When he woke, Elias was gone. No footprints, no sound, just the journal, lying open beside the dead fire. The last page contained a single line, scrawled in uneven ink. "It wears his face, but it is not him." Riley waited half the day, shouting Elias's name until his voice cracked, until his throat burned. Nothing answered, and then he knew, whatever had taken Mateo, whatever had mimicked Harold, had now claimed Elias too. He walked back alone. Days later, Riley reached Sparrow Ridge. Sunburned, ragged, dehydrated, but alive. He carried Elias's journal in one hand, his own empty canteen in the other. The townsfolk took him in with quiet stares, whispering behind their doors, unsure what to make of the man who had gone after Harold Greene and returned looking years older, with eyes that didn't blink enough. He told no one what had happened, not at first, but word spread. Especially when the coroner called for Riley days later. They had found a body, 12 miles north of town, lying in a dry arroyo, curled in the fetal position. It was Elias, but his body was untouched. No wounds, No signs of dehydration or exposure. His skin looked pale, preserved. His mouth hung slightly open, his eyes were still moist. But the organs were missing, not removed, simply gone. No scars, no openings, no blood. Inside the chest cavity, nothing but dust. The coroner refused to sign off on a cause of death. No insects had touched the corpse, no scavengers, as though something about the body signaled to the natural world, "Stay away." Riley stood over the body for a long time, looking into Elias's face. It was peaceful. Too peaceful. As if the fear had been drawn out before the end. That night, Riley returned to his office and locked the door. He pulled out every document, every map, every journal Harold had written. He laid them across the floor and began to trace patterns, paths, references, dates. And then he saw it. A sequence. Every disappearance connected by time and geography. Every person lost had passed near one of 3 points, the triangle Harold had drawn. Each point aligned with a recorded account, 1891, 1912, 1937. Harold's map hadn't just been a route, it had been a cycle, a warning. And it was happening again. He turned to Elias's journal, searching for clues in the final pages. One section caught his eye. It mimics thought. It doesn't just wear skin, it wears memory. It doesn't want to be seen, it wants to be remembered. That's how it survives. Riley closed the journal. The pieces began to align. Whatever this thing was, bonewalker, echo, hollow. It didn't hunt in the traditional sense. It didn't chase or strike, it infiltrated, it became. It spread through attention, like a parasite of recollection. And Harold hadn't been running from it. He had been offering himself to it, maybe to learn, maybe to merge, maybe simply to be remembered by something older than time. Riley wasn't sure what terrified him more, that Harold was dead or that he wasn't. That something still wearing his name wandered the desert waiting for someone to notice. Outside, the wind picked up. And for a fleeting second, Riley heard his name, soft and distant, spoken in a voice that sounded far too familiar. 3 nights after Elias's body was found, Riley returned to Harold Greene's house. He didn't tell anyone. He drove in silence, the headlights cutting through the desert like a blade, each mile sinking him deeper into the memories that clung to the skin. He wasn't following a map this time. He didn't need to. The directions were etched now, not on paper, but in thought. Harold had drawn them. Elias had walked them. And now Riley carried them. The house stood unchanged, a dark silhouette against the moon-bleached ground, the same sagging fence, the same stillness. Yet something about it felt different, not hostile, not welcoming, expectant. Inside, dust clung to the air like static. The symbols on the walls remained, but fainter, as if time had begun to erase them. Riley moved through each room with measured calm. He wasn't looking for answers anymore. He was following a call. Downstairs, the basement door creaked open before he touched it. The descent was slow. Each step echoed too sharply. The sound compressed like it was being eaten mid-air. The air was colder now, and dry in a way that felt unnatural. Not desert dry. Burial dry. He reached the bottom. The map on the far wall had changed. It was the same desert, but the markings had shifted. The red X was no longer on the plateau. It had moved, now located in a darkened spot shaped like a circle, intersected by spirals. Beneath it, written in a hurried, slanted hand, entry, not return. Riley approached the wooden door at the back of the chamber, the one with no handle, no hinges, the one that had once refused to move. This time it opened. No sound, no resistance. It simply gave way. Inside, the walls were carved with the same spirals, but now they pulsed faintly with light, as if alive, as if breathing. The corridor bent in ways that defied geometry. Riley walked straight, yet felt himself descending. The air pressed closer, like water thickening with depth. His ears began to ring, not from pressure, but from voices, not loud, not clear, but constant. He walks. He remembers. He opens. The corridor ended in a chamber shaped like an hourglass. In its center stood a monolith of stone, black as pitch, smooth as glass. Around it, etched in the floor, were dozens of symbols, some from Harold's journals, others unknown, but all familiar, as though Riley had always known them. He stepped closer. The monolith pulsed once, and Riley fell to his knees. His mind split, not from pain but from clarity. He saw images, not visions but memories that didn't belong to him. A man walking into a canyon, hand outstretched, a woman singing beneath a red moon, a child burying something in the sand. Then a figure, tall, faceless, arms longer than its body, standing at the edge of all things, watching, always watching. And then the desert, stretching forever. Not empty, not silent, full, of names, of echoes, of things that once were. Riley's hands pressed to the floor, trying to ground himself. The stone was warm, and it pulsed with a rhythm, not a heartbeat, but a remembering. He could feel it now, beneath the surface. A presence, vast and slow, pulling not at his body but at his identity. He began to forget, not facts, not knowledge, but shape, self. He whispered his own name, but it came out wrong, unfamiliar, as if it belonged to someone else. Then, from the monolith, a figure emerged. It was Harold, or what remained of him. His body was desiccated, hollow yet upright. Skin like parchment, mouth sealed, eyes open, but not blank, aware. Harold didn't move, but his presence reached out. Riley understood. He hadn't died. He hadn't escaped. He had become, not a ghost, not a victim, a vessel. The presence around them surged. Riley felt it pulling at him now, asking, not demanding, not forcing, but inviting, to join, to remember. He closed his eyes, and in that moment, he saw everything. The names lost in wind, the voices buried in sand, the truths too ancient for language, the watchers in the stone, the faces in silence. And one phrase repeating endlessly in the dark, "We don't go mad in the desert, we remember too much." He didn't know how long he had been on the floor. Time no longer moved in straight lines inside the stone chamber. Minutes folded like paper, hours bent around thought. Riley opened his eyes, but the world had changed. Not its shape, but its meaning. The walls no longer looked like stone. They shimmered, like skin stretched over memory. Harold still stood before him, not breathing, not blinking, but watching. And now Riley understood why. This wasn't a prison. It was a memory vault. Not for things, but for people, for selves. A place where identity wasn't lost but stored, layered, preserved. Harold had entered it willingly, sacrificing the flesh in exchange for continuity. Not survival, but transmission. "Harold," Riley said, but his voice fell flat, swallowed before it could echo. The figure didn't respond, not with sound, but the monolith behind it pulsed again, and with it, Riley saw images explode behind his eyes. 1,000 memories, not his, not Harold's, shared. He saw ancient people around a fire, chanting the same symbols carved into the chamber walls. He saw stone tablets shattered and buried, songs hummed across generations, faces painted in ochre and silence. He saw the same figure, the Bone Walker, moving through every era, never changing, always the same, not hunting, witnessing. It was the archivist, the collector, the keeper of all that is forgotten, and Harold had become its librarian. Riley tried to step back, but his legs refused. Not paralyzed, transfixed. His body remembered fear, but his mind was flooded with awe. The impulse to flee faded. A part of him, some primal core, wanted to know more. And then Harold moved, slowly, silently. He stepped aside, revealing the wall behind him, smooth, reflective, not quite glass, not quite liquid. It held no reflection, only light, and shapes inside it, dozens, hundreds. Faces floating like dust in amber, some contorted in terror, others peaceful, all silent. One of them was Matteo, another, Elias. They were still, but aware. Their eyes moved, slowly, watching him. Harold gestured toward the wall, and Riley felt it again. That pressure, not a command, an invitation, step forward, join them, let go. But something held him, his wife's voice, that gentle hum. It came from nowhere, but it was real. And it was enough. He stepped back, staggering. "No," he whispered. "Not yet." The faces behind the wall didn't react, but Harold did. His head tilted, just slightly, as if acknowledging, not disappointed, just aware. The monolith pulsed again, brighter this time, and the whole chamber trembled. Riley felt his skin ripple, like static crawling over every nerve. Then darkness, not blackout, ejection. He awoke outside the house. The sky was grey with morning. He was lying in the dust beside Harold's front steps, covered in a fine layer of sand. The door was shut behind him, locked, as if it had never opened. His limbs worked, his breath returned. But something inside him had shifted. The silence was no longer oppressive. It was familiar. And far in the distance, the desert breathed. The silence clung to him long after he returned. Days passed in fragments. Riley wandered the town in a trance, avoiding questions he couldn't answer. He no longer slept, not because of fear, but because sleep felt unnecessary. His dreams had already crossed the boundary. He no longer dreamed alone. But he had brought something back. Not physical. Not seen, an understanding. The desert wasn't empty, it was layered. Time didn't move through it, time folded within it. And somewhere beneath the dust and heat, the bone walker waited, not to kill, not to harm, but to receive, to preserve. And now Riley had seen what few ever had. He spent his nights transcribing what he could remember, sketches, words, symbols. Most of it unraveled the moment he wrote it. Concepts resisted language. Images collapsed when described. But one phrase returned again and again in his handwriting, even when he didn't remember writing it. "You must tell them, or they'll forget me too." He wasn't sure if the words were his or Harold's or someone else's, and then came the fire. In the early hours of September 9th, Harold Greene's house burned to the ground. No signs of ignition, no lightning, no storm, just a pillar of smoke rising silently into the dawn. Riley arrived as the last embers smoldered. Firefighters found no body, no bones, nothing but stone scorched black and ash too fine to sift. The basement had collapsed entirely. The monolith, if it ever truly existed, was gone, but not forgotten. Because Riley remembered. He carried it now. He felt it in his bones when the wind shifted direction. He heard it whisper when static flickered on radios. He saw it in the corner of his eye, just at the moment between sleep and wake, tall, still, patient. And then, one night he returned, not to the desert, to the cave. The coordinates were etched in his mind. His truck died miles from the site, but he walked the rest, compelled by something older than choice. It was exactly as he remembered, the cave mouth like a wound in the earth, the path inside colder than logic allowed. But this time he was not alone. The moment he crossed the threshold, the air shifted, not violently, deliberately. Like a breath being drawn, inside the walls pulsed again, and the monolith waited. No Harold this time, only stillness, and a soft hum, his wife's melody. He followed the sound, to the final chamber. The wall of faces, they floated like before, trapped in amber memory. But now there were more. He recognized them. Names long erased, faces lost to newspaper clippings and forgotten archives. But they were here, watching, remembering. And then one moved, not violently, just enough to speak without sound. Harold. His eyes met Riley's, and this time they blinked. The chamber trembled, not from fear, but from acknowledgement. Riley stepped forward. He placed a hand on the stone, and in a single moment he understood what Harold had meant. This place, this realm, it wasn't a tomb. It was a record, a library without books, a truth without words. The Bone Walker was no monster. It was the librarian, and Riley had become the messenger. They found him 3 weeks later. A rancher just outside Maricopa spotted a figure stumbling along the edge of the dry riverbed, sun-scorched, gaunt, clothes ragged and clinging to his frame. At first the man thought it was a drifter, until he saw the eyes, too alert, too focused, like someone still watching something far away. Sheriff Tom Riley was brought into the local clinic. The nurses said he never asked where he was, never spoke, just held onto a leather-bound journal with shaking fingers, refusing to let it go. Doctors ran tests, no dehydration, no heat stroke. Physically he was sound, but something inside him had changed. Something old had taken root behind the silence in his stare. When they finally opened the journal, they found hundreds of pages, names, dates, phrases repeated over and over, some in English, some in languages no one could identify, some scrawled over others, layered in symbols that looked like a mix of astronomy and prayer. But always, at the center of each page, he remembers. The town didn't know what to do with him. Some said he'd gone mad in the desert, others whispered he'd brought something back. But most just wanted to forget. People stopped mentioning Harold Greene's name. The house, now just blackened foundation, was bulldozed, the land sold cheap. A new developer promised a fresh start, clean lots, prefab homes, a future. But the silence stayed, and Riley stayed too. He never returned to duty, never resumed his post. He bought a small property near the outskirts and rarely came into town. When he did, he was cordial, distant, always watching the horizon like he was waiting for something to move. A few children dared each other to visit him. The braver ones said his windows were covered in carvings, that his shelves were lined with rocks and bones and notebooks full of nonsense, that he never slept. One boy swore he saw Riley talking to no one, standing barefoot in the sand behind his home, whispering names into the wind. Most people ignored it. It was easier that way. By the fall of 1952, the town had moved on. But something lingered. Every so often, strange things happened near the old Greene property. Radios cut to static, dogs barked without cause, birds refused to fly overhead, and on quiet nights, people claimed they heard humming, soft and slow, drifting across the plains. Riley heard it too. He sat on his porch most evenings, journal in lap, pen scratching across paper. He wrote every day, pages and pages of names. Some he recognized, most he didn't. He believed it was important, because if he didn't write them down, no one would remember, and that was the danger, not death, oblivion. He never spoke of what he saw in the cave, not directly, but in a rare conversation with the postmaster, he offered a sentence that stuck. "Memory is a landscape," he said. "And the desert is where it goes when we stop tending it." He died in 1984. Neighbors found him seated upright in his chair, facing west. His eyes were open, mouth slightly parted, no signs of distress. But the strange part was this. The coroner noted mild burns around the eyes, as if he had stared directly into the sun for hours. But it had been a cloudy day. On the table beside him, a closed journal. The last entry, written in perfect handwriting, unlike any other in the book, read simply, "You must tell them, or they'll forget me too." Decades passed. By the early 2000s, Harold Greene's name had faded from public memory. His journals, scattered across private collections and forgotten archives, became footnotes in local folklore, if mentioned at all. The desert has always swallowed what didn't fight to be remembered. But the silence had cracks. In 2007, a doctoral student named Rachel Devlin stumbled upon an unmarked folder while cataloging microfilm at a university archive in Tucson. Inside were 6 photographs, several dated letters, and a map that matched the desert outline near Sparrow Ridge. Scribbled in the margins were names. Greene. Riley, Ortiz, Finch. One document caught her attention, a scanned journal entry from an unnamed source mentioning a phrase she didn't recognize, "place of red silence." Rachel was drawn in. Over the next 2 years, she collected fragments, a prospector's note from 1891, a missionary's diary entry from 1937, a ranger's radio log from 1986, abruptly cut off mid-sentence. They all mentioned strange silences, sudden disappearances, distorted time. One even referenced a figure seen at dusk, tall and motionless, standing on the ridge. Rachel began compiling them. Patterns emerged. Roughly every 25 to 40 years, something happened in the same region. People vanished, or came back wrong, or returned with stories that couldn't be verified, believed, or spoken out loud. She published a small article in an obscure journal. No one noticed, but someone else did. In 2010, a YouTuber named Dan Kessler reached out. He ran a growing channel focused on real unsolved cases. His video on the Dyatlov Pass had gone viral the year before. Rachel was hesitant, but Dan seemed genuinely curious, and better yet, resourceful. He asked if she would show him the site. She refused. But she gave him coordinates. He disappeared 6 weeks later. His last video, uploaded automatically by a scheduled queue, featured drone footage of a red plateau, eerily quiet, visibly untouched. The final frame was him speaking directly to the camera, wide-eyed. Something's wrong here, not wrong like dangerous, wrong like misremembered. Like this place was never meant to be remembered. That was the last anyone saw of him. His body was never found. Rachel kept silent for years. Then, in 2017, she received a package, no return address. Inside, a journal, leather-bound, pages filled with dense, looping handwriting she didn't recognize. The first half seemed like nonsense, dream descriptions, fragments of dialogue, symbols repeated until they bled into each other. But halfway through, a name appeared, Harold Greene, then Sheriff Riley, and at the end, scrawled in dark ink, "This is not death, it is remembering." Rachel contacted a linguist, then an ethnographer, then a folklore archivist. Each offered interpretations. None felt right. One night, she brought the journal to an elder of the Tohono O'odham community. He read only the first page, then closed it, handing it back. "We do not open what's meant to stay closed," he said. "That place does not forget, but it does not forgive being disturbed." The government responded differently. By 2021, the entire region near Sparrow Ridge, roughly 40 square miles, was declared restricted land for environmental hazard monitoring. No official explanation, no public announcement, just fencing, cameras, and silence. To most, it became another forgotten stretch of Arizona. But for those who looked closer, the land carried a hum, a pulse. And in old forums, in whispers, the legends returned. Of the tall figure in the heat haze, of the cave that folds time, of a man named Harold Greene who walked into the desert and became something more than lost. In the years since, Harold Greene's story has remained half lost, half remembered. For most, he was a name buried in county records, a footnote in the long, dry history of Arizona's forgotten men. But for others, for those who felt the wind shift strangely along the desert's edge, or who heard faint humming in places where no music should exist, Harold Greene became something more, a signal, a warning, a whisper left behind. In 1986, a young hiker named Melanie Kerr vanished near the western perimeter of what would later be known as the restricted zone. Her journal, recovered weeks later by her brother, included a final entry. "I saw the tower, but there's no structure there, only shadow. I think it's watching me, and I think it knows my name." No one believed it, no one wanted to, and yet the pattern persisted. Every few decades someone disappeared, every few decades someone reappeared, changed, always near that same circle of desert. The stories varied, but the symbols were the same. The spiral, the eye, the silence. Some now believe the phenomenon isn't localized, that the bone walker, if that's even the right name, isn't a creature, but a function, a memory engine, a sentient echo living beneath the desert, older than civilization, that absorbs not the body but the story of a person. And that perhaps was Harold Greene's goal all along, not to solve the mystery but to become part of it. Riley understood this in his final years. He stopped writing names. He started drawing faces, dozens, hundreds, all without eyes. And then, one day, he simply stopped altogether. They found him looking west, lips parted, humming. No sound came out, just air. By then, few remembered what had begun this story. And maybe that was the point. Because the Bone Walker doesn't take lives, it takes presence. It makes you linger. In wind, in silence, in memory. And that's where Harold Greene remains. Not in a grave, not in a journal, but somewhere out there, beneath the skin of the Sonoran Desert, walking its long spirals again and again, waiting to be remembered. Just once more. So the silence doesn't win. If you've stayed with us this far, thank you. Stories like this, about loss, memory, and the thin line between history and myth, aren't always easy to tell, but they matter. Because when we forget, we feed the thing that waits in silence. If you found this tale unsettling, fascinating, or simply unforgettable, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We uncover hidden truths, buried lore, and the echoes that history left behind, one story at a time. And if you want to go even deeper, click the video on your screen now. It's the haunting story of the man who woke up buried alive, and what he remembered when no one else did. Because sometimes remembering is the only thing that saves us.